So in this lesson, we are going to put together all of the ways that we've learned to solve quadratic equations, and I'm going to give you some tips to determine which method to use when you're given a quadratic equation. Okay, so we're going to talk about solving quadratics using factoring, the square root property, or the quadratic formula, and how to know when to use which method. Okay, so the methods that we talked about are factoring, and this included when something was already in factored form, so we had our factors equal to 0. We also talked about factoring when a is equal to 1. We had the difference of two perfect squares, and then we also had when a is different than 1, such as using the AC method, bottoms up, slip and slide, or the X method, whatever you decided to do there. With the square root property, that's where we had x squared is equal to some number. We could call it a if you want, or we had our parentheses x minus something squared or plus something could be equal to a number where really you're allowed or you are able to take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus here. And then you could solve for x that way. And then, of course, the quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so ways to determine which method to use. So this is the train of thought that I do. Make sure as you're doing these problems that you find a pattern that works for you. So first, I would start with the square root property because that's a particular form that applies. With the other two methods, they are usually in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Same thing here. Okay, but with the square root property, it's a particular form. So I would look to see, okay, does the square root property apply? Can I get it into that form? And if the answer is no, then you make sure that your quadratic equation is set equal to 0. I would try factoring first. Don't forget about your special factorizations. If factoring doesn't work, then you could try the quadratic formula. If you want a more definitive way to determine between factoring and quadratic formula, you can use what's called the discriminant, and that is given by b squared minus 4ac. So again, we're still talking about when it's set equal to 0 to be able to identify a, b, and c. This is connected to the quadratic formula. It is the term that is under the root. Okay, and so if the discriminant is a perfect square, use factoring. That means that if you have a perfect square under the square root, you're going to get a whole number or an integer, and then that'll tell you that it could have been factored. Okay, if it's not a perfect square, then you can use the quadratic formula. Here's some more fun facts about the discriminant because I can't help myself. So if your discriminant is less than 0, that means that there's two imaginary roots. So your roots are going to involve I or two imaginary solutions. If it's equal to 0, then there's one real, or it's called a double root. Okay, so 5/8 and 5/8. Or if it's greater than, and that should say greater than 0, then there are two real roots. Okay, so then that's just talking about not using I. So some examples. Determine which method to use. So we're not going to solve these, we're just going to talk about a method. So I would look at this and say, okay, it doesn't look like square root property. Then I would see if I could factor it by seeing if I could multiply two numbers to get to 3 and add to get to 1. The answer is no, so this would be a quadratic formula. Okay, if you're going to use the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, b is 1 minus 4 times a times c. Okay, this is 1 minus 12, negative 11, not a perfect square, so this would be quadratic formula. Okay, and using my fun facts about the discriminant, this would mean that there are two imaginary roots. Okay, so this is a way to kind of check your work as well. Next, determine which method to use. So I have x minus 2 squared. This looks to me like square root property. So if you wanted to confirm, you could subtract 5 from both sides. And there we go. We could take the square root of each side and then be able to isolate x. So this one is square root property. Okay. I should mention that sometimes in the homework assignments or assessments, you may just be asked to solve. So it won't say solve using factoring, solve using square root property, solve using quadratic formula. You'll have to know which method applies. Okay. Determine which method to use. Okay, so I see an x squared, but I have a 5x on the other side. Okay, so that's not square root property. So that means I'm going to make sure that this is set equal to 0. X squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. And so from here we try factoring. Two numbers that multiply to give us 6, add to give us 5. That's possible. So you could factor this one. Or if you use the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, b is equal to 5 minus 4 times a times c. This is 25 minus 4 times 1 times 6 is 24. I got 1. 1 is a perfect square because 1 times 1 is 1. So that also tells you could factor. And then again, using my fun facts, it's greater than 0. So there are 2 real roots, meaning doesn't involve I. Okay, determine which method to use to solve. So we have x squared is equal to negative 36. So we have x squared equal to a number, or it's in that form. So this would be square root property. Okay. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.